Hi, so now that we've talked about all the different types of research designs and sampling, we're going to wrap up this section by talking about survey research. So survey research is a really common way to understand attitudes, beliefs, behaviors among the larger population. And there's different ways that we can administer surveys for survey research. A common one is self-administered questionnaires. So those could be surveys that we send out through the mail. They could be surveys that an instructor hands out in class and asks you to fill out. One of my first jobs was handing out surveys on a bus to people to have them fill it out and find out what their opinions of the bus system was. So there's a lot of different ways. You give someone a questionnaire or you mail it to them and you ask them to complete it and send it back. Now, response rates are really challenging. Ideally, we would like 50% response rate or more, right? We'd like at least half of the people we send surveys or hand surveys out to respond, but it can be really challenging to do so. And what happens is if we give out 100 surveys and only 50% of people that give them back or mail them back or bring them back, that means there's 50% or half that didn't respond. And so sometimes what happens is the people that responded are the people that cared the most about it. Another example is a lot of times for research at universities, teachers will give students extra credit for participating. But I read a really interesting article several years ago that said that a lot of times the students who do the surveys for the extra credit are the ones that already have high grades in the class. They're motivated, they're interested. And if you're trying to look at something like factors that lead to negativity or factors that lead to student anxiety and potential withdrawal from the class, they may not be the ones that fill out the survey. So you get this very biased sample of students. And so non-response bias is this idea that when we have not enough responses, we have to think about, who returned these and why? It could be something as simple as maybe we didn't translate that into the language that a lot of our individuals who are receiving it need. For example, when I gave out surveys on the bus, they only gave me surveys in English, but I lived in an area that had a lot of people from Mexico, so they couldn't read my survey. So the surveys people did complete didn't really represent the whole population because it was only in one language of the two that people spoke in the area. So really things to think about. Now, low response rates aren't the end of the world. They do often provide some information. Even if I get 50 people to respond out of 100, that's still better than nothing, and I might have a good kind of basis, but ideally we want more of a response rate. And so over time, there's a whole science to this, and there's a lot of different techniques that increase that response rate. One is following up with participants, maybe mailing it out and then giving them a phone call or going to their house. They do that with the census. Having a motivating cover letter that's clear and the directions are clear. Using self-mailing surveys that people just fill out and drop back in the mail. They don't have to worry about anything. They don't have to worry about like postage or anything like that. Having a short survey with clear directions, and a lot of things like using incentives. Sometimes people put a dollar bill or a couple dollars in there, or they'll say for every survey you send back, it's an entry into a raffle or a drawing. For students, it might be saying, hey, you'll get a couple of extra credit points. So some sort of incentive. And one of the challenges that you look at in your city training is that if the incentives are too high, it really can coerce people. So we have to find that sweet spot of just enough incentive to maybe motivate people to return our surveys, but not so high that they feel like they have to. So here's an example of two different survey research studies that I found. So this was a fieldwork for a multi-method study, and what they did is they administered a series of online surveys to graduates, asked them to complete it and send it back. So it looks like the rates of completion of the online survey varied between 29 to 44%. So these lie within an acceptable range of responses to the surveys, according to Manthorpe et al. And so you can see they asked students to return the survey, and the survey response rates were 29 to 44%. In another study by Stanley and Sebastian, they sent out questionnaires, and then they made repeated visits to collect the questionnaires from the respondent. And so they even said in their research article they had to go out several times, but they were still able to get a response rate of 62%. So even just the difference between following up with people or saying, hey, did you get that survey done, and not can impact the response rate. So there's a couple different ways that we can administer the surveys beyond self-administered questionnaires. We can also do what are called interview surveys, which is where we're asking a series of questions and we record the responses of the individual. There's a lot of different ways to do this. We can do this face-to-face. We can do telephone surveys, although those are becoming less common, online surveys, or virtual interview surveys where you meet someone over Zoom and they ask you a series of questions. Now, these tend to have a much higher response rate than just mailing out a self-administered survey. Rubin and Babbie note that if done well, you can get closer to 80 to 85% response rates, which you can see is much higher than some of the previous studies we looked at. It also has the advantage that interviewers can clarify or ask probing questions if needed. Obviously, there's typically a very strong structure to it. Also, they can see body language. If you ask a question of someone and they don't know the answer, and they hover between two options on a self-administered questionnaire, you may not know that they really struggle with that question, but an interviewer can see someone being confused. So definitely some benefits from that. Now, some of the challenges are things like interviewer bias, where the expectation or opinions of the interviewer interferes with the judgment of the interviewee. We've talked about those kinds of bias throughout the semester. And so this can affect the outcome positively or negatively. Maybe the interviewer wants it to be successful, and so they act in a way, consciously or unconsciously, that gets it there. Sometimes they just don't realize, but you're just eager and you're nodding and people keep saying yes, yes, even though they don't think that. The other challenge can be when the interviewer doesn't fit your audience. Maybe they don't speak the language, maybe they look different, and so that can be a challenge. And it really requires intentionality when selecting and training interviewers. If you've got 5 interviewers, odds are they're all going to interview slightly differently, and so you have to make sure you're really training them so they know how to do this, so they're consistent in their interviews person to person. Finally, the book talks about a couple of other survey types. Telephone surveys, I had the joy of doing that when I was in college. Some benefits, right? There's no commute. You can call all over the country and survey people's attitudes or beliefs about different things. It's safer. You're not going into people's homes, which can sometimes be unpredictable, but it's limited. It's limited to people with phones. And even though many people have phones now, not everyone does, or they have minutes and they don't want to waste their phone minutes talking to a survey person. There's limits on nonverbal cues, so we don't really know what our participants are thinking as much as maybe a face-to-face interview. And my phone says, hey, telemarketer calling, and I am unlikely to answer it. Many of your phones probably do as well. So then if it's an unknown number, people aren't likely to answer it. So telephone surveys have really started to drop in their popularity. What we have seen is an increase in things like online surveys. They're quick, they're easy, they can automatically calculate responses, they can detect missing data. You know, if I have someone filling out a self-administered questionnaire by hand and they miss a line or they miss a space, I may not even notice it as I'm frantically trying to put their data into my system. But online it can say, whoop, question missing, question 9. Or you can say, hey, person can't move on to the next question until they answer this one. It can also save money because you're not having to pay and train interviewers, but obviously lots of limitations, lots of potential bias, right? The idea of the Yelp or Google review, it's people who tend to feel really strongly about a topic or a product, or people who feel really strongly against it will probably respond. And we don't know if it's representative. We don't know where people are logging in from. It could be people who live locally. It could be people who live all over the world voting on something. So you don't always know what you're sampling frame, what your population is, and if it's got good external validity. And then finally, the book mentions the idea of mixed methods, that there are different ways. You might have multiple contact options. Doing a survey, you have multiple ways to contact people. So you might send out a mailer in the mail, you call them, or you text them. You might have multiple response option where people can either fill out a paper copy of the survey or they can go online and respond to the same survey. Or you could do it both, combine contact and response mode. You have multiple ways that you're contacting participants and multiple ways that they're able to complete the survey. Finally, the book talks a lot about kind of the strengths and weaknesses of each. Overall challenges related to survey research is that depending on the type of survey research, we don't always know what the sampling frame looks like, and it's pretty limited in generalizability. We could say, oh, this many Americans feel this way about a topic, but if it was a biased sample or they all came from one socioeconomic group, it may not actually be representative. We may not be measuring what we think we're measuring. Sometimes that happens where you think you're measuring attitudes about something and it ends up being something totally different than people interpret it as. Participant responses may not be as accurate when it comes to self-reporting, and sometimes that is simply because we don't want to put things that don't make us look good. We talked about that in earlier chapters, right? That idea of social desirability, and we want to make ourselves look good. Finally, survey research is helpful, but it is lower in validity. It's harder for us to say did A cause B when we don't know what the population looks like, but it is high in reliability. Survey research is great. It's consistent. You know the same form is going out to lots of different people. Now, a percentage of them may not know how to interpret it, but if 95% interpret it the same, it's probably going to have higher reliability. And so page 399 does a really good job of outlining the strengths and weaknesses of each of the different types, and I definitely encourage you to look over that. Okay, so here are my references. For the next few chapters, we're going to jump into qualitative research, designs, methods, and talk more about that process. Thanks.